In the year 2050, the world was a vastly different place than it had been just a few decades before. Climate change had wreaked havoc on the planet, causing natural disasters to become more frequent and more severe. Resources were scarce, and war and famine had decimated the human population. But despite all this, there was still one survivor left. His name was John, and he had been born into a world that was already on the brink of collapse. As a child, he had seen entire cities destroyed by floods and wildfires. He had watched his friends and family members die from diseases that had become all too common in the polluted environment. But somehow, he had managed to survive. John was now in his 60s, and he had spent most of his life wandering the desolate landscape, scavenging for food and shelter. He had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and he had witnessed the slow decay of the natural world. But he had never lost hope that one day, things might get better. As he walked through the ruins of yet another abandoned town, John reflected on all that he had seen. He thought about the friends he had lost, the lovers he had left behind, and the children he had watched grow up and die. He wondered if there was anyone left in the world who still remembered what life had been like before the collapse. As the sun began to set, John found a small shelter to spend the night in. He built a fire and cooked some scavenged food, then settled down to rest. But as he lay there, he heard a strange noise outside. It was a faint rustling, like someone was moving quietly through the rubble. John cautiously got up and went outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but he saw nothing. Then he heard the noise again, closer this time. He turned around, and there she was. She was a young woman, barely more than a girl, with wild hair and a fierce look in her eyes. She was carrying a bow and arrow, and she held it at the ready as she approached John. At first, John was too shocked to speak. He had thought that he was the last survivor on Earth, but here was someone else, someone who had somehow managed to survive all this time. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their past and their hopes for the future. The girl's name was Sarah, and she had been living alone in the wilderness for most of her life. Together, they decided to try to make a life for themselves, to start over and build a new world from the ruins of the old one. It wasn't easy, but they persevered. They traveled together, scavenging for food and supplies, and slowly but surely, they began to rebuild. They found other survivors, and together, they formed a community, one that was based on cooperation and mutual support. John and Sarah fell in love, and they worked tirelessly to create a world that was better than the one they had been born into. They knew that they would never be able to erase the scars of the past, but they believed that they could build a brighter future. Years passed, and John and Sarah grew old together. They watched as their community thrived, as new generations were born and raised in a world that was no longer defined by destruction and despair. And as they looked back on their lives, they knew that they had been lucky to survive, but they also knew that they had done something more than just survive. They had built something new, something that would endure long after they were gone.